This episode is supported by FX's Grotesquerie, a new series from executive producer Ryan Murphy. Heinous crimes unsettle a small community, and the local detective feels these atrocities are eerily personal, as if someone or something is taunting her. Starring Niecy Nash Betts, Courtney B. Vance, Leslie Manville, and Travis Kelce. FX's Grotesquerie premieres September 25th on FX. Stream on Hulu.
We are
Cultivate.
We are Cultivate.
Hello and welcome to Ye Olde Crime, where we discuss the funny, strange, and obscure crimes of yesteryear. I'm your host, Lindsay and joining me today is a very special guest, Neil Laird. Neil is an LGBTQIA+ multi-Emmy-nominated director of historical films for Discovery, BBC, PBS, History Channel, National Geographic, and many other networks. He has produced over 100 programs around the globe that feature crumbling Egyptian tombs, lost Mayan cities, and mysterious shipwrecks at the bottom of the sea. But to his continued disappointment, he has yet to stumble upon a time machine to see these places when they were shiny and new. His book, Primetime Travelers, the first in a series of novels based on his years making Antiquity TV, aims to remedy that grave injustice, which we will discuss at the end of the episode. Neil, welcome to the podcast.
Why, thank you for that lovely and long introduction. I appreciate it.
We connected on Podmatch when you reached out about discussing the world's first recorded heist and court case, which, amazingly enough, takes place over 3,000 years ago in ancient Egypt. So, kind of before we dive in, I am curious to know if you can tell our listeners kind of what got you interested in history in the first place.
Egypt has certainly always been my great fascination, but I've always loved, all ancient history. When I was young, I thought I would become a filmmaker and do narrative films, and then I got my undergrad degree and moved to New York City, think I'd become Martin Scorsese overnight. Instead I was a poor schlub holding a walkie-talkie, crappy grip truck in the middle of the hood, And I was lucky to get those jobs. I had so much bloody time on my hands, and I would hang out at the New York Public Library because it was free and had air conditioning. And one day I picked up a book off the shelf for whatever reason on the rise of civilization, something I did not get in my small Catholic school in Western Pennsylvania. And some penny dropped, and I became absolutely enamored of this lost, forgotten time up until the modern world. So I resolved to teach myself history through the free books in the New York Public Library, at least until they called for the next crappy film, in the middle of the hood.
Yep.
So I had a lot of bloody time in my hands. And then when I got to Egypt and the ancient world, I got stuck. I became so enamored and so fascinated of those cultures, particularly Egypt, but also Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome, up into the fall of Rome. I couldn't get past 476 AD when Rome fell. I got bored after then. Christianity came along, got a bit samey. I've been there, done that. I want to stick back with his jackal-headed gods and all kind of weird stuff, step pyramids.
Yes.
So I went back to grad school, got my master's degree in documentary film, made my thesis in the Great Sphinx of Egypt, clambered all over the Sphinx and discovered hidden passageways and sold that to Discovery Channel and been doing that stuff ever since. So Egypt is very much in my blood. I know so much about Egypt that, I don't have to research any of the stuff we're going to talk about today. It's as long as my brain's working, it's still up there.
We kind of think of tomb robbing as like a relatively new thing, like when the Victorians stumbled upon Egypt and were like, oh, we need to take pieces of antiquity home with us and show it off to all of our friends because we're Victorians. And that was the thing. But it actually started much, much earlier than that, like all the way back to the early dynastic period, way back when Dozer's pyramid was looted, which I'm sure there's going to be some Ghostbusters people out there that are like, oh, Dozer, But so That kind of leads me to what we're going to be discussing today. So I'm going to kind of sit back and let you kind of take the reins, if you will, on telling us a little bit about tomb robbing and kind of how we even learned about how long it's been going on.
Well, you could argue many do is the second oldest profession after prostitution. I mean, as long as someone
Yeah.
put gold in the ground, someone went to get it. And that's
Yep.
exactly what happened. Egypt, particularly, but again, in the other cultures too, Mesopotamia would bury riches with their dead. But the Egypts took it to a crazy, crazy level where the pharaohs of the old King Dozer and the Great Pyramids, those were tombs. When you think of the pyramids, they were not sundials to the gods or anything like that. They were tombs so they could take it with them. And in every case, those tombs were all robbed in antiquity. Keep in mind, we know King Tut's tomb, and if you go to the Cairo Museum, you see the classic golden mask, but it is the only tomb that's ever been found intact of thousands of tombs over 3,500 years. That's the one that the tomb robbers back in the day did not get. So the pharaohs and the rich wanted to take it off with them into the next life. But of course, the viziers and the mayors and the people who buried him exactly how to get in. And they knew once the pharaoh's dead and mummified,
Yep.
ain't nobody looking. So quite often, those tombs in many cases were robbed by the very people who built them. So if we flash forward, there's three kingdoms in Egypt, and I won't bore you with them. The old kingdom you're talking about, middle kingdom. The new kingdom is the one people mostly know about. Nefertiti, Ramesses, Akhenaten, and King Tut. All the stars.
Yep.
And that was also the last great flourish. By the time all those pharaohs were dead and dusted, by the 19th, 20th dynasty after Ramsey the Great, things started to fall apart. And tomb robbing became epidemic around them. We're talking about 1100 BC, where everybody was corrupt. The pharaohs and the viziers, which is basically a prime minister, they were not sharing the riches with the land. They were fighting often the Hittites and the sea people up north. So they were being taxed with grain. This was before money. So they would just take, they wouldn't feed you. So it was famine. And by 1100 BC, people kind of had enough. Not only is we're going to talk about the world's first known court case and the world's first known robbery, the world's first known strike took place then as well, called the
Mm-hmm.
Year of the Hyena, where only the hyenas were eating well. And basically a bunch of workers at the temples in Luxor, modern day Luxor, which is Thebes back then, they went on strike because they're not getting fed, and they had to sit down. They sat down at a temple, and they would not move, and they would not feed the priest, and they would not do the work, and they would not dig the tombs, they would not keep the canals clean until they got their grain and their beer. And it was all recorded on a papyrus that we still have today. And the pharaoh capitulated. He gave to the laborers what they needed. And so, of course, he did it 2 or 3 more times. But that paints a picture of the world that we're going to talk about now. As the world's first known robbery and court case. What brought us together talking about ye old crime was there are 2 papyri that have survived, and it's a miracle they survived at all. One was found underneath a pillar that fell down in a broken temple. The other one was hidden in an old alabaster jar or something, and they never thought they would last at all.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that any paper lasts from that time period is pretty amazing because it was just pressed reeds. It obviously is very degradable. And these 2 papyri, which almost were conflicting points of view of the same crime, are fascinating. I wrote a book on it, fictional book, because of course you don't have all the details. But in essence, what happened was, if you've ever been to Egypt, you certainly have been to the Valley of the Kings. And the Valley of the Kings is where King Tut was buried, where Ramses the Great and Seti and all the great pharaohs in the New Kingdom were built. It is a bunch of honeycomb cliffs on the west bank of Thebes, modern day Luxor. The west bank is where people go are buried because that's where the sun sets. The East Bank is largely where people live. So you cross the Nile, and that's where the necropolis are. So the Valley of the Kings has, I think, 67, 68 pharaohs for 4 or 5 dynasties up until the collapse of Egypt in the 21st dynasty. And King Tut is the one we know so well. But by the 20th dynasty, everything was falling apart, as we mentioned. And there's an amazing city that still exists, one of the few cities that all Egypt that still remains, because most cities were made of mud brick and disappeared. We only have the temples and the tombs that leaked. But there's one town that was so important. It was made of stone, and it still exists. And it's called Deir el-Medina. And Deir el-Medina is the worker city of the people who built the tombs for not just the pharaohs, but the elite, the kings, the queens, the nobles and their wives, because there's hundreds and hundreds of tombs. So they were very rich. The best artisans of the day And they have beautiful tombs themselves. And they were allowed to live on the West Bank, the land of the dead, because they lived building the tombs and stocking the tombs and creating the gold mask for King Tut and the gold slippers. All the artisans lived over there, so it quickly could be shuffled and shoved into the tombs and sealed up so the pharaoh could take it away and no one could touch it. But of course, when things started to go to shit and the pharaoh stopped feeding you, they said, wait a minute, I know where we can eat. I know how to get into that tomb. And not only with these tombs are twisting and turning, they go way into the mother rock. And we think of our Indiana Jones or booby traps. They certainly weren't like rolling balls things. People talk about razor thin wires that go across to decapitate you. It's a lovely idea, but there's no actual evidence of that. But there's two things we know they did do for booby traps. One is they put huge pits in the darkened thing. So if you're walking along, you don't know, you fall down a 30-foot pit, you break your leg, you're stuck, you're going to die there in the tomb. And the other thing they did is when they sealed up the tomb, King Tut's tomb, they saw this and Howard Carter found it in 21, they put huge boulders all the way in the shaft. So you had to get past all these boulders. It's clogged to get to the riches below. However, if you built the bloody tomb, you know you can do a workaround and go up the hill and come down where it's very thin and it's only a foot or so until you get into the chamber. So these rich artisans who knew all the secrets started breaking into the tombs. And they obviously had a very, very good system, and they clearly were working with the mayors and the elite at the time. So the Abbott and the Amherst Papyrus talk about one case where basically the corrupt mayor of the West Bank, a guy named Passer, he obviously was on the take, and he was allowing people to break into the tombs as long as he got his cut. And these tombs, mind you, they're not just a few like little gold bars. If you look at the images of King Tut's tomb, King Tut was a minor pharaoh. He was a nothing nobody, the boy king who died after 6 or 7 years. You can imagine what Ramsay the Great's tomb must have looked like. Gold chariots and masks, and just unimaginable riches, all gone. By melted down by the viziers and the mayors, and then used and resold and all that kind of stuff was a system. So, anyways, the mayor was clearly on the take, but a new mayor had come down from the capital of Memphis on the East Bank, Luxor, the living city, and he got wind of all this corruption. And I'll be making more of the details than we have because obviously it's papyrus that is 3,000 years old. But the gist of it is that he was the squeaky clean deputy coming in to fix Dodge City. And he was horrified by all. So he found out from talking to a few tomb robbers that they were being robbed. Pharaoh's bodies are being burnt as well. And this is not just gold riches. If you believe in the religion, which of course we assume Pawara, the mayor of the East Bank, did, if you take away a pharaoh's golds and riches, they cannot survive. They cannot go to the next world. They cannot make it to the field of reeds and live forever because they need the amulets, they need the gold to get there. So you are denying a God-given king of his ability to stay in paradise. So it's a deep religious significance. Everything back then was religious as well. It wasn't just greed, though of course I'm sure the cynicism suggested otherwise. So he did a last inspection, and he got 4 or 5 of his guys from the East Bank, and he went over and he found a bunch of these tombs desecrated. And this is all recorded on papyrus. And they would break into the tombs. They would tunnel down very slowly at nighttime when no one was looking. Probably, as you can imagine, any heist film today in a bank in downtown Cincinnati or whatever. It's the same bloody thing. It's just in the honeycomb cliffs of the deep desert. And so they have these. We still see these tombs. We still see these tunnels today. The tunnels that are made by the tomb robbers 3,000 years later. You can't crawl in them because they're so dangerous. You look up and you can see how they got in, usually from the roof. And they were systematically stealing it and giving the mayor, Passer, probably his cut. And then they got caught red-handed. And then we have the world's first court case as well, where there's something called a kenbet, which is a local jurisdiction in a way. It's almost like going to City Hall. And because, of course, things weren't quite as fair today, you were guilty until proven innocent back then. So they would twist your hands, they would burn your feet, they would put you upside down, and they would beat you until you told the truth, which seems to be counterproductive. So of course everybody spilled the beans. But these people would not give up Passer, the bad mayor, for whatever reason, or he was too duplicitous and too quick. So the court case ends with a stalemate. Some of the tomb robbers are killed, but many are let go. And the bad mayor, Passer, survives, and we see more records of him. And the good mayor, Poirot, disappears from history. So in this case, good did not triumph. But this is literally a snapshot of a world 3,000 years gone. We don't have names or cities, entire things we don't know about them. But these accidents of history allow this one little sneak peek into this world that we otherwise be totally missing. And as far as we have until something else is found, it is the world's oldest known crime, oldest known heist, oldest known strike, and oldest known trial in history.
It's crazy. Like, I was looking up some of the things that were listed in those papyri that you mentioned. And, like one of the things that they did is they were saying they needed to go search 10 royal tombs, 4 tombs of the divine Adoratrix,
Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
and, like the citizens of Thebes, their tombs as well. And they discovered that like all of the citizens' tombs had been desecrated. 2 of the divine tombs had, but only one of the royal tombs had been disturbed, and that was of King Sebekemsef II.
Yeah, it's tough to say that. Any way you say it is probably right because any Egyptologist would know how to say it either. So you're close enough.
But then thankfully, none of the tombs in the Valley of the Queens had been disturbed, which was noted on there. But
They say that, of course.
yeah, who
Right.
knows?
Someone's papering over the cracks.
Kind of how you alluded, like just how easy was it for looters to get access to a tomb to be able to steal from it?
Not easy at all, as you can imagine. This is the riches. This is the bank. This is like Fort Knox. So they were all guarded. They even had an elite army out there, mostly called the Medjay, and the Medjay were mostly Nubian assassins. The Nubians were south of modern day Sudan, and they were brought up, and they were just vicious warriors. And they would hire them to guard. They were cemetery guards. They were the police of the West Bank, and each tomb had a couple Medjay guards out front to watch it 24/7. And during when times were good, like King Tut's time or Hatshepsut or all the other greats from that time period, things went very well. They were all well fed. But clearly things were breaking down by this point. The Medjay may be on the take. They may have not been paid. They may have left. They didn't give a toss anymore because they were not getting their wages. Somehow they got in. And of course, the tomb robbers could sneak around. You and I could not even get anywhere near the kings or the queens or the nobles because we would, as soon as we put our foot on the West Bank, we'd be arrested. It was a sacred place for the pharaoh and his offspring and the policemen who guarded it. So it wasn't a place like today where I'm here in New York, I can bicycle around Greenwood Cemetery, and have a picnic lunch.
Yep.
Cemeteries are different now than it was back then because, of course, there was too much at stake. So it was very, very hard to get there. But again, even the Deir al-Medina is a fascinating place because there's trails that go along the cliff face, and you can still walk them today. It's about a 2-kilometer walk, and it circumvents everything else, and it hides in the shadows of the Nile and in full view. So these people had access to them. That's why they pretty much assured that it was the elite tomb workers and builders who built it because nobody else could get near it. And of course, they knew the secrets, so they could come in the back door. They could sneak in even if the Medjay guard's out here with a spear in his hand. If they're quiet, they could come in the middle of the night and dig down. And it would probably take months and months, perhaps years, to get these places. And the fact that every last one was looted in antiquity, 67 some tombs, suggests that it was a major operation. We can't say it was all the elite tomb builders of Deir al-Medina, but they were by the time Egypt collapsed, King Tut's tomb only survives because he was a forgotten king, and someone, I think it was Ramsey VI or somebody, built a tomb right above his. So all the shavings and all the rocks, when they built it, hid his door, hid his entrance, and he was so forgotten that no one looked for him anymore. So it was a pure accident. The fact that he survived is because he was so deeply insignificant, and that's why Howard Carter found him in the 20th century, knowing that was the one of the few tombs that had not been found and desecrated.
And it's funny to think of that one of the most famous rulers of Egypt, that like everyone knows who King Tut is, that he was a nobody. Like, it's funny, but also like a good thing that he was a nobody, because now we have some concept
I can always imagine. I think even in my books, I might have even written this, where my time travel books, yeah, and Primetime Travelers, my first book, they go back and study the father of Ramsey the Great and one of the great pharaohs. He's incensed that he finds out in the past that this nobody boy king is remembered, and he has masks and puzzles and coffee mugs, to his name, and movies made in his name where he's said it's long forgotten. King Tut was a boy king that died before he was 18. No one knows exactly why. He was a very weak leader, the son of the heretic king Akhenaten, so he was erased from history. Another thing that helped him, because he and his father were heretics, and they literally were erased from the record. By 100 years later, they were just forgotten. They weren't even on the walls anymore. Their names weren't erased from history, which in Egypt was death. And yet here we are talking about King Tutankhamun, a total nobody. That'd be like, be coming back 1,000 years later, and the only president we know is Herbert Hoover. It's just wow. We missed the boat on something.
Exactly. We kind of talked about it a little bit when we were talking about how these artisans would get in the tombs. So you mentioned like the decapitation wires and all this kind of stuff. Were there other? I'm gonna pick on like a mummy movie just to kind of get an idea. So Hollywood will portray things like certain rocks will move and then it'll flood the tunnel or things like that. So what sort of actual booby traps would there be? I mean, you mentioned the boulders and the pits, but were there any others that?
One thing I didn't add about the pits, which is important, is they were spiked at the bottom with very heavy wooden spikes, which we still have. So if you fell into the pit, you were eviscerated on spikes. So they know, but all the wonderful ideas of, like, I think it's what is that? The Egyptian, the 50s movie with Joan Collins gets stuck in the tomb. If you ever saw that, it fills up with sand. That's beautiful stuff,
Yes.
but it was way too intricate for them, because they really kind of thought they could take it with them. They thought the Nubian guards would be around forever, but they did try. It became so endemic that, again, what they'd also have is false doors. If you go to Ramsey the Great's tomb, for example, you have an entire tunnel that goes down and then it gets stuck, and his sarcophagus is actually hidden somewhere else. So they kind of throw them off the set, which is crazy, because you think to build in the living rock, all this labor is just to create a dead end. So those are things they did. They obviously couldn't have any living animals in there because they would die. They might have had some other spikes, but anything organic would rot. And they haven't found that stuff, even if it's kept intact. So there may have been these ideas of other booby trap tombs. They certainly knew they were going to get robbed if they didn't do something. I think one of the pyramids had a tripwire. Yeah, there's a great pyramid where you would go in, and as soon as they went in, they knocked, partially like the film, the Gillian Collins film, they banged out something where a bunch of boulders came down and sealed it in after them. So if you go to the
Gosh.
Great Pyramid today, it's a modern, I think, 16th century tunnel that circumvents those boulders and gets around to get in, because they plugged it up with huge boulders on the way out through sand, so it just slid down into it. That's about the best they could do. In terms of any kind of weaponry, there's no conclusive proof. It's fun to think about, but we just don't have that evidence.
We have the royalty that firmly believed from a religious standpoint that, if they didn't have all these things with them, they could not go on to the final plane to like live forever. So then part of the mystique was they'd have these curses, like if you took anything from the tomb, you're going to be cursed and like you wouldn't be able to like move on. But towards like the downfall of the dynasty, how were people's views changing as they started to just be like, curses are nothing, I'm gonna loot it anyway? Like how had like the shift been made?
Well, by the end of the 21st dynasty, I think for context, 19th dynasty, we have the Ramses. The last great pharaoh, arguably, we like Ramses III, which was about 1200, 1170 BC. And then you have two more dynasties that come along before it collapses completely, and then it's taken over by the Persians and the Libyans, and eventually the Ptolemies, the Greeks. So it never becomes, it ends there. It goes on, but it's ruled by outsiders. So by the 20th, 21st dynasty, everything was just going to hell. And, back then, your leaders claimed to be god kings. And if they're not providing, if you're starving, then you give up on the pharaoh and you give up on them, on the gods, and you will find other gods. So when they weren't providing, it was just hell was let loose, and it was a free for all. And that's probably when a lot of these even smaller tombs were broken into. Remember, it was only the elite that could afford mummification, which we didn't talk about. It's a very expensive process, and it takes 70 days to soak a body in natron, which is a kind of salt that can only be found out in the eastern desert, the Siwa desert and stuff. So that's money. You got to pickle that person. You got to get in there, get a priest to take out all the organs, and then sew him back up or her back up so it looks good. Then you need fine linens to wrap it up with some amulets so they go through the duat, the underworld, and make it there. It's for the rich. So the poor people, if you were just dumped in a little cavern, maybe with maybe a few pots and maybe like one of your favorite keepsakes, you could take to the next road. So it was very much a have and have not kind of thing. So of course people will probably say, well, screw you. All the rich have been, the linen alone would feed me and my family, let alone the jewels on it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a total breakdown in the us versus them. And that's one of the things that contribute to the ultimate demise of the pharaonic culture, which still lasted 3,000 years if you add being ruled by others. It's longer. America's been around for 250 whatever. So put that in context. It's a long, long run, but it just collapsed like any other culture. And by the end, it was everything. The temples are being looted, destroyed. They were being reused to build barns. And that's why the fact that so much remains at all is surprising, considering that even after the pharaonic culture, there's this dead temple there. I need to build a place to house my donkey. So I'm going to tear it apart and flip it upside down, and I got myself a barn. So that's what happened to the ancient world. It just basically became repurposed.
That brings up an interesting image for me, because I was just recently reading a book about how in Europe, they have this practice of repurposing the graves because they don't have as much space to like rebury people. So they'll like bury them a little bit deeper and then they'll bury somebody else on top. So it's kind of like that concept, only with these tombs of like the pharaohs and different rulers and things like that. And it's just being repurposed into a barn instead of
Dead gods. You don't have to pray to Amun or pray to Seti or pray to Isis anymore. So I'm just going to use that boulder and I'm going to build myself a canal. And again, that happens all through history. When I made my first film about the Great Sphinx of Egypt, I was in Cairo, but it was a very modern twist to that story. The people that were restoring the Sphinx, which was the 90s, I made this film. They're a bunch of traditional stonemasons they hired from East Cairo, which is essentially the poor part of the city, to restore it theoretically in the ways of the pharaohs built it, because it was falling apart. Pollution and rainwater was destroying the Sphinx. So they tried to restore it. And they actually didn't try, they did it successfully by using the old methods. But I mention it because all the workers came from the far end of Cairo, and many of them lived in a place called the City of the Dead. And the City of the Dead is a huge Islamic medieval cemetery that was used from about the 12th century to the 15th or 16th century. Gorgeous mausoleums for the elite during the Caliphate time, during the Islamic time. And when those people died, the bodies were pulled out and poor people moved in. And my stonemason that I followed in my film, Saeed, he lived in one of them. So I met his family, and he lived in a 12th century mausoleum. Had no plumbing, but it was right outside. You didn't want to drink that water, because it definitely was not coming from a tap. But they were living in the City of the Dead. That's all gone now because the Egyptian government tore it all down to build a motorway, and they said it was unsafe for people. So sadly, all of those tombs are gone, or the lion's share of them are gone. It was a snapshot I'm so glad I saw years ago before it all went away.
It's crazy. We're talking about like the serfs that are essentially raiding the tombs, but it wasn't just them that raided the tombs either. Like there were some rulers that also would go in and be like, that's mine. Like they don't need that. I can take
As
that.
soon as the pharaoh's dead, if you look at one of my favorite places in Egypt, my favorite ruins, a place called Abydos, Temple of Seti, which is in the middle of Egypt, halfway between Luxor and Cairo, kind of off the beaten path, so it doesn't get as much tourist traffic. But it's amazing because it has a full roof, and it's got beautiful, and therefore it's preserved. You got beautiful colors. But it was started by Seti the First, and then finished by his son Ramses the Great, who was one of the biggest megalomaniacs in history. And I mention it because although it was nearly finished by SETI, you go in there now and it was all erased. And it's like he took it, like he took a Sharpie and he crossed out SETI and he put his name in. He took the pharaoh's face and he changed it a bit and put his head on it. He just as soon as Dad was dead, he moved in and made this lifelong temple of his father, which he helped build as his firstborn, and he made it for himself. That happened all the time. King Tut. They argue that some of King Tut's tomb might have been Hatshepsut, a female pharaoh that ruled before him, and they just repurpose it. So there's great cynicism there, as you could imagine. Why you give lip service to the gods, as soon as that pharaoh is dead, the argument is, well, we're all of the same god, so I'm just going to take your tomb and make it my own because we all come from Amun-Re, or whatever bullshit they needed to explain the fact that it was theft.
I just thought that was funny. Like, and especially in the instance of Ramses, where he's just like, yeah, my dad's gone. I got this. Like, this is...
He knows it looks like your dad, you know. You going to complain? Write a letter?
Exactly. Exactly.
And Ramsey lived 96 and ruled for 68 years and sired hundreds of kids. So you didn't want to piss him off.
Exactly.
They call him the Great only because Egypt is festooned with his image. I mean, he was probably a total despot like they all are. But you go anywhere in Egypt, you see Ramsey the Great's head looking up at you because he either appropriated earlier pharaohs or he just build. He's just a megalomaniac. That's why we know Ramsey. We know King Tut because he survived the ravages of time. We know Ramsey because he just couldn't say no. He just had to keep building and building. We call them today the Greats, but for all we know, they were all both awful people.
That's very true. It's hard to know without, unless some other random papyrus gets found wherever and is like, yeah, he was actually a great guy. So
might be, but you know, the pharaohs and the fact that those two papyrus we talked about survived, they were done outside the royal court, and they were just, you know, the local magistrate wrote them to record something. They didn't go to the Royal Hall of Records, and of course they didn't write anything bad about themselves. So you won't know anything bad because the pharaoh and the queen would never write it down. Everything is, you know, ship shape. And it's only the accidents of history that'll common people. There's a wonderful other group of papyrus. It's here in Brooklyn or here in New York where I live. Forget the name of the papyrus, but basically it's a series of letters from a father to his son. And his father was minding a tomb. He was like a mortuary clerk or whatever, minding a tomb. You brought the offerings out to people in a very small tomb in Middle Egypt, like near Abydos kind of. And his father was away on business. And he kept writing letters saying, I hope that you're doing a good job, and I hope that my new wife, you're treating her kindly. I know she's young. I know she's younger than you. You be nice to her, even if she snaps at you. It clearly was a dispute between a father and his errant son who doesn't like the new wife and who, you know, he's writing these stern letters. And what's fascinating is you only get the father's perspective. He writes the letters, and they're all hidden underneath a sarcophagus in this tomb. So you can only imagine the post came, and the son grabbed the letters and read them and said, oh, shit, another letter from Dad. And he crammed it underneath the sarcophagus just to get rid of it. And if he wrote something back, we don't have what went to Memphis. We only have the angry letters from Dad about, you make sure you do your job right. Don't be lazy. Treat my new wife lovely. And the son, just out of sheer, you know, annoyance, shoved him underneath this thing. And because of that, it survived. Because that one tomb survived the ravages of time, we know more about this father and his son than almost anybody else that lived during that time period, because the accident of history. It's such a classic story of what happened to the wife, because she disappears in one of these letters that Agatha Christie wrote a novel based on called Death Comes at the End. And it's all about who killed off.
That is a good point to make. It's the accidents that we learn about. It's not, you know, the planned things that get left behind. And
people can build enormous. I was just in Turkey writing my new book, and I visited 3 of the 7 wonders: the Colossus of Rhodes, a temple of Halicarnassus, and the temple of Artemis in Turkey and Rhodes, and they're all gone. And these were the great icons of the ancient world, and now there are a few pillars in a swamp. Colossus of Rhodes is totally gone completely. Yet we have these letters from a father and his son from 3,500 years ago that nobody would know anything about if it wasn't for the happenstance of him shoving it underneath a bench.
So we've mentioned your book a few times. So now I would like to give you the opportunity to tell us a little bit about Primetime Travelers.
Sure. As I mentioned, I'm a TV producer, still am doing documentaries. But I wanted to start making shit up, I wanted to start playing with stuff. And so I wrote my first fiction novel a few years ago. And I figured the best way to kind of tell that story and stand out was to use my own experience as a TV producer. So it is
Sure.
about a band of TV producers who make an almost ancient alien like show, a kind of cheesy TV show from cable,
Mhm.
based on people that may or may not exist, that I may or may not have worked with. And they go Abydos and they stumble upon a false door, which is a portal to the ancient past. So they were invited to go back to the times of Ramsay the Great and tell a story, the promise of telling the best story ever told and winning an Emmy. But what they don't know is, of course, it's the real Ramsay the Great who's after them, and they have to escape the 12 hours of the Duat to get out, the 12 gates, and all the gods and goblins and the underworld, and they have to take the solar boat and rise on the 12th gate. So it's this fun chase film based Facebook of a sort of feckless TV crew with their cameras and their boom poles going in the Egyptian underworld and surviving. And the second book, which comes out in October, is Primetime Pompeii. So once they go back
Okay.
in that hit, they're invited by the network with a bigger budget to go back and do a 2-hour special about the eruption of Pompeii. So they time travel to Pompeii and they get some of the dates wrong and they think they have 40 hours to get out of Dodge and they got 25 hours. And I documented very meticulously how Pompeii erupted in 39 AD because it's all kind of written down by Pliny the Younger and we have some good details. So I used all that historical data that I do as a DV documentary, both in the Duat story and in this one, but I put this fantastical comedic story on it about this TV crew who was basically traveling in the past to make cable TV. And then book 3 is about Troy. They go back to ancient Troy, which is where I was in Turkey, and they get in the Trojan horse with Achilles and Patroclus and Agamemnon, and they tell the story of the Trojan War because they still haven't gotten that Emmy. That's it in a nutshell.
How many shows do they have to do
Exactly.
to get that Emmy?
I survived the ancient war 3 times. How many shows until I get that little gold statue?
How many pounds of flesh do I need to lose for you to?
Nicely said.
Before we kind of close out, like I feel like we kind of glossed over like the myriad of things that you have been able to do throughout your career. So, in your opinion, what are some of the most enjoyable places that you've been able to visit throughout your career of documentary filmmaking?
Well, it's a tough one, I guess, because it all depends on the story and the places. I've been to 70 some countries and have my name over 1,000 hours of television, but didn't go in the field for all of them. Clearly, Egypt is a special place, and I did my first films there. But I love the jungles of Angkor in Cambodia, and I was there on digs, and I got a chance to see stuff come from the ground for the first time. A place off the beaten path. I did this on a holiday. I didn't make a film there. It was Burma and Bagan. If you've never been to Bagan, Bagan. It's not on the tourist circuit, mostly because a junta runs the country, and people don't want to go there. But it's this amazing archaeological site. 50 or 60 Buddhist temples that just festoon this open plain with a meandering river between it, and you just hire a bicycle and you go from one to the other and have a bottle of wine and watch the sunset go down over Mandalay River, and you're on the top of a beautiful Buddhist temple. I mean, it's a joy to get to. So the love and the lore of travel, particularly ancient or lost worlds, has kept me going both in my television career and now in my novel writing career. It clearly has been that inspiration that has given voice to my creativity for the last 30 odd years. And it hasn't extinguished yet. So I can well imagine that, I'll do it until I'm, mummified.
You got to make sure you get the right salt, though.
I'm going out with style. I'm taking it all with me, baby. And I'm not going to tell you my secret so you don't sneak in behind. Neil told me on that podcast there's a back door.
I heard there was a back door.
Trash collection, but only on Tuesdays.
What's over there?
Exactly. You're taking notes now, I can see.
Well, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you today, and I am so thankful that you reached out to be on the show. Is there anything else that you would like to share with our listeners before I kind of let you go?
Don't think so. I think, anytime someone asks me this, I always say, particularly with travel or creativity, whatever you want to do, do it. Don't wait. You want to see the pyramids? You want to see Angkor Wat? You want to write that novel? Do it tomorrow. Book that travel tomorrow. Because it's amazing how it will change your life, and it's amazing how quickly life goes. We all know how swiftly it goes. So if you got something on your bucket list, start ticking those boxes.
Well, and I think you shared earlier a perfect example of why, like with the Valley of the Dead, that's no longer
Yeah.
there. Like, it's important to see these places before, just like the Gardens of Babylon, like they're just a story and they don't exist anymore.
Yeah, I mean, when I go back to places now, I was just in Turkey, and I just went, back to an ancient site that I hadn't been to in like the '90s, and it's fallen apart. I didn't take care of it because they can't afford it, and the one of the temples collapsed, and they just done the Turkish money, and that's just in 30 years. So you want to see something, see it now, and even if you get there too late, you're still seeing it. You can imagine it. It's just travel to me has just been so inspiring, and writing and creativity. It's been a font of all this, of all everything I've done. So whether it's, if it's not travel, whatever your muse is, don't extinguish it. Leap, then think about it.
Those are good words to live by. I would like to thank Neil so much for being on the show. I'll make sure that we will have a link to his website in the show notes. So if you want to learn more, learn about the books, see all there is to know about Neil, there will be a link in the show notes to his website. And thank you again for being on the show. And on that note, as always, I'm Lindsay, and we'll see you next time with another tale as old as crime.
Cheers.